All right, thank you everyone for joining us today. We will formally commence our question and answer event for today. We thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us for this. But we're really excited to be able to offer this session in collaboration with our valued partners, the Commission for Children and Young People. Today, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands that we meet on, acknowledging that we're meeting on the lands of various traditional owners around the state of Victoria. I would also like to acknowledge their connections to land, sea and community. We as an organisation pay our respect to elders past and present. And we also acknowledge that we're joining you today from the lands of the Wurundjeri and Bunurong peoples. If you'd like to, you're more than welcome to list where you're joining us from today as part of our acknowledgement. I would like to formally introduce our speakers today who've been really generous with their time and knowledge to make this session possible. As you can probably see on your screen, we have Elinor from the Commission for Children and Young People, as well as her colleague Emily. We also have my colleague Gillian, and they will be responding to the questions that were pre-submitted as part of efforts to make today possible. And a big thank you to all of our partners who submitted questions in advance to make this as beneficial as possible. In the interest of today running as smoothly as possible, I'm just going to take us through some protocols. And thank you in advance for your patience, because I know it's not the most fun part of the meeting, but yeah, thank you. So we ask for this session that everyone please ensure that you're muted. And as we've noted in prior communications, we're seeking to record this session so that we can maximise the benefits and impacts of this valuable opportunity to hear from the Commission on questions identified by the sector. In the interest of enhancing your user experience, we encourage you to ensure that you're on speaker view, and to make that possible, on the top right of your screen, you should have a view and then an image that looks similar to a calendar. And if you select that, you should be able to select speaker, and that will just enhance your user experience today. As we go through the session, if you have any additional questions that come to mind, you're more than welcome to list them in the chat. And one of our other collaborators, Natalie, from the Commission for Children and Young People, will, where possible, share links to resources that might be of value. And I'll also be keeping a record of the questions that we receive. And if we have time at the end of the session, we'll go through those. Terrific. That takes us through all of the protocols. Now I'd like to hand over to the team at the Commission, who will share some information about them as a team, as well as what they do. And this part of the agenda was an initiative of theirs based on some of the questions they thought the information would be of value. So over to yourselves.
Thanks very much, Vittoria. Just bear with me whilst I share my screen.
Thank you.
I just want to check, can people see that screen? Has it worked, the share? No?
Not yet.
Let me try again. How about now?
Yes.
Beautiful. All right. Look, thanks everyone for having us along. I know we've spoken a couple of times over the years with members of Volunteering Victoria. It's incredibly valuable dialogue for us to continue to have with volunteering organisations. We've got a few of us here today to answer your questions, and it was great sort of seeing what people are interested in. And I thought, it might be worth us just talking very, very briefly at the start about some of the basics, so that we're all on the same page going into the more detailed questions. So I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we're working and speaking and living from today. I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend a particular welcome to any Aboriginal people in the room with us today. So look, about the Commission, a lot of you will have heard of us, some of you won't. We are an independent statutory body, so we are not the department, we are an independent organisation. And under legislation, our role has been set up to promote safety, wellbeing and rights of children and young people in Victoria. You'll hear of us in lots of different ways. You might see us in the press talking about concerns that we may have about government policy or advocating for best practice responses to children and young people, in particularly those in vulnerable situations, such as when they're in care or in youth justice systems. I guess today we're with you in our role of supporting and regulating organisations that work with children and young people to prevent abuse and make sure that organisations have good and effective child safe practices. So in short, we're a regulator. But as part of regulating, our job is also to help organisations to understand the laws, child safe standards, reportable conduct scheme, and also how to create safety within organisations. So it's a really important part of how we view our role. Child safe standards, it's a compulsory framework that supports organisations to promote safety of children and young people by requiring them to implement policies, prevent and respond to allegations of abuse and harm. The thing I want to highlight there is it's the law, in short. It's mandated for organisations. There's about 60,000 organisations in Victoria that have to comply with the child safe standards, and the child safe standards have been around in Victoria since 2016. So we're many, many years down the track now for these laws. There's been some changes along the way to hone them, and also some recent changes in the last couple of years that have given us, the regulator, some more powers to be able to take action where we're worried that an organisation may be putting children at risk. The other thing I want to just briefly mention is that there's actually 6 regulators for the child safe standards in Victoria. We are but one of them. We've got about 33,000 of the organisations that need to comply as organisations that we're responsible for regulating. But if you're a registered school, for example, you'll have a different regulator for the child safe standards. That would be the VRQA. If you're delivering early childhood services, you'll have the Department of Education as your regulator, so on and so forth. So there may be some people in the room who have actually got another child safe standards regulator as well. I want to assure you, we talk a lot, us regulators, to try and support there to be consistency in the way that we work to achieve outcomes for children and young people. And I flag that as well because you may want to just check any information and in particular requirements for your sector with your individual child safe standards regulator. Reportable conduct scheme is a different set of child safety laws. It only applies to a much smaller group of organisations. There's about 12,500 organisations who have to comply with the reportable conduct scheme. And it was great seeing kind of the titles of the organisations coming into the room. It really gave me a sense that there are some people in the room that have to comply with the reportable conduct scheme as well, but not everybody. Just because you are a not-for-profit or a charity, that does not mean that you have to comply with the reportable conduct scheme. However, if you are providing early childhood services and a range of other things, then you will have to comply with the reportable conduct scheme. If you're not clear for your organisation, if you have to comply with the reportable conduct scheme, we've got certainly information on our website that will help you determine that, and please give us a call. Under the reportable conduct scheme, allegations of abuse have to be notified to the Commission within 3 days of the head of the organisation becoming aware, and then there's obligations to investigate, let us know about the outcomes of that, and then there's a direct connection over to working with Children Check, for example, if there's substantiated findings. So The other thing which was really helpful to us to sort of see from the questions coming in, was around just helping you understand child safe standards versus working with children check requirements and how they all, pardon me, how they all intersect. So uh, uh, I guess what I want to be clear on is working with children check is a screening process for assessing and also then reassessing people who work with children in Victoria. And there are many people engaged in child-related work, including in volunteering, who may be required by law, by the Worker Screening Act, to hold a working with children check. And then there's other people within your organisation which you may decide to require to have a check, not because the Worker Screening Act says, but because you want to do that as part of your management of risks to children, as part of your obligations to comply with child safe standards. So just understand that there's one set of laws that says you must have a working with children check, and then there's another set of laws that says you must screen people, and you may choose to require working with children checks as part of that screening. We don't administer the working with children checks. So if you've got really particular detailed questions about working with children checks, you will need to approach Department of Government Services, who actually administers that check. And I know Natalie and Elinor, through the chat and through our talk today, will just be focusing on a few things there to help you kind of navigate some of that. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and I think hand over to Gillian for the questions.
Thanks very much, Emily. So what we've done is that we've organised questions into themes. So I'm going to mention what the theme is. On occasion, there are more than one question which relate to a theme. If they're two very similar questions, I'm going to ask both of the questions, and Elinor and Emily will respond to kind of both of them at once, if that's okay. So the first of the themes is national organisations. And the first question is, Victoria has more requirements to child safety compared to Commonwealth requirements. Could you run through these with us? If funding is received from the federal government, but the activity occurs in Victoria, do we need to comply with Victorian regulations?
Thank you, Gillian. Great question. So look, firstly, let's start with what I said earlier around legal requirements. So in Victoria, organisations are legally required to comply with Victoria's child safe standards if they are operating one of the organisation types that are listed in the Child Wellbeing and Safety Act. So this legal requirement has been in place, as I said, since 2016, long time now, pardon me, and this law still applies. What that means is if subsequently the federal government may have allocated you some grant funding and you are now also required to comply with the national principles, that doesn't in any way displace your existing legal obligation to comply with Victoria's child safe standards. Now, in 2022, Victoria's standards were changed to align them more closely with the national principles. So Victoria has had child safe standards well before the national principles existed. And in fact, the Royal Commission sort of recommended that everyone else adopt something like that as well. So now Victoria has shifted its standards to be more closely aligned with the national principles to try and promote that harmonisation between jurisdictions. The national principles are these high-level principles, and they set out, a national approach to creating organisational cultures and practices that promote child safety and wellbeing. If you are complying with Victoria's child safe standards, you will be meeting the requirements for the national principles, right? So that is part of a national agreement. A simple way for you to think about this is if you're required to comply with the child safe standards in Victoria, if you comply with the child safe standards in Victoria, you will be meeting any obligations in respect of the national principles. So you may as well aim at the Victorian standards is one way to think of it. It is correct that Victoria has a couple more requirements compared to the national principles. We've got 11 child safe standards, and obviously there's 10 national principles. And I'll talk to you now about the key differences for you to understand. We have Child Safe Standard 1, which states that organisations must establish a culturally safe environment in which the diverse and unique identities and experiences of Aboriginal children and young people are respected and valued. This standard does not exist in the national principles, but it was a really important part, I think, of the changes that were made to Victoria's Child Safe Standards, was to create this standalone principle that really makes a really important statement about what's necessary to create safety for Aboriginal children and young people in Victoria. So yes, that is different. We've got extensive guidance on how to implement that and deal with that. And we've been seeing some really good work across Victoria as organisations think through how they can make their organisation ultimately safe for Aboriginal children and young people. So that's a really important difference. The Victorian standards also have a stronger emphasis on empowering children and young people. So we have a slight difference to what I think is National Principle 2, Child Safe Standard 3, where we've got the word empowerment in there, not just informing children of their rights, but empowering them. Why have we got that? Well, that existed in the previous standards, and we've seen the importance of that in terms of prevention of child abuse. If a child within an organisation is not just informed about their rights, but is empowered, I think it creates an extra level of protection. Now, if you're talking with colleagues in other states and territories, that they may tell you, in fact, that their view is that kind of concept of informing rights also includes empowerment. So I'd be surprised, to be honest, if you found much difference in practice in what you're required to do there. The other thing probably to understand about Victoria standards is we have what are called minimum requirements. And this is this kind of next level down of guidance for organisations about what they have to do to meet Victoria's standards. Now, they are consistent with guidance that was issued by the Australian Human Rights Commission many, many years ago around the national principles. So I don't think that's a point of inconsistency. It's a way of, I guess, the Victorian standards providing really much more detailed guidance for you about what you have to do, as opposed to having some high level principles. I might leave it there, Gillian.
Okay, thank you, Emily. So second question, volunteering virtually where the location is different from the activity. And then with that coming the navigating of different working with children check requirements, which is often really difficult for organisations and volunteers. Is there any move to a national approach in the future?
So as I said at the start of the session, we actually don't administer the Working with Children Check system, but what I can tell you is that I know that the National Office for Child Safety has listed harmonisation of working with children checks as a priority. So as I understand it, there is some work going on nationally to look at all of that, but it's not something that I'm personally privy to. But it is a question that we do get frequently, is trying to understand those arrangements between different jurisdictions and ways that can all be aligned.
And yeah, maybe I can just answer from a Volunteering Victoria and the state peak body sort of perspective. Is we are very aware of the fact that there are different checks in different states. It's very, very tricky for organizations to manage, particularly if they are based in a number of states and they have volunteer programs in different states. We are working very closely with the state peak bodies, other state peak bodies, and with Volunteering Australia to continue to advocate for more consistency in volunteer screening and checks across the various states. I mean, as Emily says, while there are national principles which attempt to provide a sort of nationally consistent approach, each state is still now currently responsible for their own screening, and while that happens, there will be a difference. And we will just keep working in that space. The National Strategy for Volunteering has actually identified an action for the development of a national volunteering passport, which I guess falls within that concept, but is a much bigger issue and challenge, and something that will take some time to get to. But yeah, just work being done to try and make sure we are consistent across states. Okay, so the next theme is we've titled it Guidance, Resources, Practical Tips. And there are two that are very similar. So I think, Elinor, you're going to talk about this one, but I'm going to ask both of them together. The one is, what are the best resources to support and achieve compliance with the standards beyond basic compliance? Does the Commission have any guides for volunteer-run organisations which are simple and easy to navigate? And the second question, which is very similar, is how do we successfully embed the standards into our volunteer community? Can you share some practical tips to embed the standards in everyday practice?
Great, thank you, Gillian. So to answer both of these questions, we do have a large number of resources on our website that can help you achieve compliance with the standards. So we tend to suggest organisations, including volunteer-run organisations, start by reading our short guide to the Child Safe Standards. So this provides an overview of each standard alongside the minimum requirements that Emily just spoke to, and also compliance indicators. The compliance indicators can essentially be used to create your action plan or your to-do list. And we also have a lot of templates on our website that can be easily adapted for volunteer-run organisations. So, for example, we've got one for a child and wellbeing policy, we have a code of conduct, and we have screening tools as well. We'll link to these in the chat. You can then go to our most comprehensive resource, and that's the guide for creating a child-safe organisation. So when you have a particular issue or issues that you need more in-depth guidance, or where you have questions. So the guide is quite long, but it will give you the greatest understanding of what it means to keep children safe, and it deep dives into each specific standard as well. So we also have developed some guidance on specific standards or themes, and that will assist you beyond basic compliance. So these are our guide to implementing Child Safe Standard 1, our Empowerment and Participation Guide, and our just released Child and Youth Engagement Framework. And we'll also post links to these resources in the chat as well. We don't currently have any guides that are specific for volunteer-run organisations, but our resources are prepared and designed to assist a full range of organisations. The second question that you asked is about embedding child safety into everyday practice. So really at the heart of this question is creating a strong culture of child safety. We know that simply developing policies is not enough to keep children safe in your organisation or to be compliant with the standards. So actively embedding shared values and assumptions that prioritises child safety needs to be championed at all levels, from top down and bottom up. So some examples that I can give you for building child safety into your everyday thinking of your volunteers may be ensuring from a volunteer's first encounter with your organisation, child safety is embedded as a priority. So this should be via your screening, your recruitment processes, induction, code of conduct, and any ongoing supervision. Include child safety in any of your regular meetings. Be clear about the expectations of behaviour of everyone in the organisation and communicate this regularly. We're going to talk more to that in another question. And provide regular training for volunteers, ensuring volunteers are actively supervised on their child safety practices. Have a child safety officer in your organisation, and take every concern raised seriously. So encourage any volunteer to speak up if they have any child safety concerns. I will throw back to you, Gillian. Thank you.
Thank you. And also just to add, so apart from obviously the Commission's amazing guides, just remember that Volunteering Victoria and the sort of other peak bodies and Volunteering Australia have extensive range of guides that just make it easier for volunteer leaders to adhere to these sort of requirements. We also work very closely with Justice Connect, who have amazing resources too. We will be popping into the chat, and it will be in the notes, is links to the various guides. But there are guides for community organisations. There's self-help tools, which focus on working with volunteers. So if you're looking for something volunteer specific, check our guides as well, and you'll find there's a lot of information out there. Okay, Elinor, I've got the next question. Is what is being done to support the smaller multicultural groups, faith groups, sports clubs to comply with the minimum standards? For example, multicultural organizations where English is a second language who may be struggling to implement the standards. Apart from the online translated resources, is there any other support these organizations can receive to successfully implement the standards? To frame the question another way, what advice would you give to small multicultural organizations as they attempt to implement the 11 standards?
Thanks, Gillian. This is a really good question. So as the question does point out, we do have many of our resources now translated into 20 languages. And for a number of those translated resources, we also worked with an organization who use community checkers to review the translations. So these are native speakers of that language, and the purpose is to make sure that the translations make sense to that community culturally as well as linguistically. We're also able to arrange discussions with where further advice or guidance might be needed using interpreters. So that's another way we can support. For those in the faith community, we have built relationships with many faith peak bodies. Our goal is to empower them to support their communities to best understand and comply with the Child Safe Standards and Reportable Conduct Scheme. For sporting bodies, the Vic Sport website has many excellent resources specifically for keeping children safe in sporting club environments. But even if you're not from a sporting organisations, these resources are useful and applicable for other volunteer-based organisations as well. So I recommend or suggest having a look at those. So in terms of what advice would we give to multicultural organisations implementing the standards? So we would suggest, firstly, understanding what is required of your organisation and by checking out the resources on our website that I just spoke to. Once you've done that, reviewing what you already have in place. So make sure you take the time to understand where child abuse can happen in your organisation. Then talking about it with your leadership or your management committee, and making a list of what your organisation needs to do to keep children safe under the Child Safe Standards and, if it's appropriate to your organisation, the Reportable Conduct Scheme. So this might include changing some of your policies or processes, or it might mean you have to create some new ones. So we have a lot of, as I've spoken to, we've got a lot of templates on our website that can assist you with this. We would also encourage organisations, where possible, to consult and collaborate with other organisations or peak bodies, so to share knowledge and resources and support each other in complying with the Child Safe Standards and, if appropriate, for your organisation, the Reportable Conduct Scheme as well. Thanks, Gillian.
Thanks, Elinor. Maybe just to add, from our perspective too, is just to remind everyone that Volunteering Victoria does have a range of training, which is free, that seeks to promote awareness of volunteer management best practice. So look out for those. We also have lots of short resources that focus on a range of topics, which we hope make it easier for organizations to access the information they're seeking. We regularly identify resources or organizations that people might want to reach out to, and we circulate those where we can, and we pop them up on our website. Elinor's talked about the Vic Sports Guide. We work quite closely with Vic Sports on some of their guides, but their child safe information is really, really useful and perfectly focused. We do also link with partners around our state, and we'll often refer organizations or volunteer team leaders to chat to those place-based organizations, as they're doing a lot of work driving inclusive volunteering practice and best practice volunteer management. So look out for that, get in touch with us too, and we can find others that you can talk to and share your experiences with and check in with them. We have also had a strong focus on making access to best practice information as inclusive as possible. Our website can be viewed in a range of languages other than English, and we have translated our 5 of our most common resources into different languages, as well as into plain English versions. But also, if you do come across issues, or you have feedback, or you have challenges, maybe even ideas as to how what things we could work on, please just feed these through to both the Commission and ourselves. Volunteering Victoria, as the sort of peak body, will advocate for and on behalf of the sector for these kind of things. So just reach out to us if you're finding particular things that are challenging for you. Okay, so the next theme is code of conduct, and we've got 2 questions here which are fairly similar. One is, when sending emails to volunteers aged under 18, is it a requirement to copy the communication to their parent or guardian as well? And the next question is, do guardians need to be present at events to supervise volunteers over 16? Says, does that mean to be over 16, you think? Emily, I think you're going to try and respond to those 2.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Gillian. So look, to answer these questions, we need to highlight the importance of having a code of conduct that provides clear information in your organisation about what's appropriate and inappropriate conduct with children and young people. Your code of conduct sets firm parameters around, what are the professional boundaries that are expected within your organisation. It's a critical tool in trying to manage any kind of behavioural kind of questions, or any indeed situations such as been illustrated in these examples. The point I'm trying to make here is you get to set the rules. What do you need to do to protect children is the important way to think about it. Your code of conduct helps your volunteers know what the organisation expects of them, and how they can also safely engage with children. So it also helps them see the safe path to engaging with children and young people. So your code of conduct needs to reflect the specific types of activities and interactions that your workers and volunteers have with children. It needs to be specific to you, is the point. It also needs to consider the characteristics of the different children in your organisation. You need to think about whether there are any particular vulnerabilities about the children and young people in your organisation that you need to cater for. Have a think of their age, their stage of development, and their diverse needs as well. So look, the first question focuses in on the use of technology to engage with volunteers who are under 18. So your code of conduct really needs to set out particularly clearly how appropriate contact can be made with younger volunteers outside of their volunteering responsibilities, right? So if you set the rule, you can engage this way, this is how it's to happen, give them a safe pathway to communication to them, help them understand how to do that properly and in the way that the organisation expects it to be done. You need to think about, in particular, whether social media contact is okay, and how will that be okay or not. So thinking about those clear parameters in relation to communication contact. We certainly do see through the reportable conduct side of things, allegations coming through where adults are engaging in an unauthorised way via social media with children and young people that they have met through the organisation. So it is something that we certainly see occurring, unfortunately. Child safe standards aren't prescriptive, right? So they are intended for you to think through the individual situation within your organisation and tailor these rules to meet the risks present to children that exist. So understand those risks and specify for your organisation. When thinking about contacting children and young people via online means, it's important to consider the risks of grooming. Grooming can use a variety of, people who are grooming can use a variety of manipulative techniques to build relationships with a child. We know that this behaviour can and does occur online. Some examples to manage these risks could be copying in emails to parents and carers, or it could be that you've got to copy in another person from the organisation as well. So some way to have transparency of communication to make sure it's not secret, it's not hidden. It should be able to be transparent with others what that communication with the child is. Second question asked for the need for guardians or parents to be present at events with volunteers over the age of 16. Again, under the requirements of the standards, we'd ask you to think about your risk assessment for that event and determine based upon that assessment. It really depends on what the event is, frankly, the children and young people in the organisation, any other things that you've got in place to protect children and young people whilst they're within your organisation, as to whether you need to have a parent or carer or guardian there, to be honest. And then this comes back down to your code of conduct as well, as to that being a key tool to manage situations where children and young people may be there without a parent or guardian. As you can see, it kind of all comes back to deeply understanding your own organisation. I might leave it there, Gillian.
Great, thanks, Emily. The next question relates to the reportable conduct scheme. Recommendations on the best way to educate volunteers on the reportable conduct scheme. What are some of the common steps people miss in identifying abuse?
Firstly, I just wanted to talk about the reportable conduct scheme and reiterate a comment I made earlier that not all volunteering organisations will be required to comply with the reportable conduct scheme. So that's number one. If you don't know whether you are or you aren't, find that out as the first thing. There's a few different ways to educate volunteers about the reportable conduct scheme. I guess one of the things that you're trying to make certainly adult volunteers know is that their conduct is covered by the reportable conduct scheme. So their conduct could be, required to be notified to the Commission, et cetera, et cetera. There's a video that the Commission has got, I think it's only about 10 minutes. It's just a short little video, which we've developed really to enable you to show it, say, at a staff or a volunteer meeting. It's online. That can be a really good place to start in terms of giving that short, sharp overview of the reportable conduct scheme. We've also got some much more detailed information sheets that really go into, what are the allegations, what's the sort of conduct that organisations need to be keeping an eye out for to make sure that they're reporting it and investigating it under the scheme. We're also in the process of finalising, a much more in-depth video that will be sort of a bit more like an information session that might go for kind of an hour or so to give you really an in-depth overview of the reportable conduct scheme. That will also be online soon. People will be able to kind of dive into that if they want to get a bit more detailed knowledge. We have a subscriber list that you can join at the Commission. If you sign up to receive updates from the Commission, we actually send you an email whenever we're producing new guidance, new resources, etc. So that might also be something worth signing up for to access those resources. You also need to think then about how you're clearly communicating with your volunteers and the children and young people, frankly, in the organisation about what's this conduct that we need to be clear needs to not occur and that people need to report. That should appear in your policies and procedures. So that's the critical thing. If you're looking at any of, whether it's your complaints process under the standards, whether it's your child safety and wellbeing policy, all of those documents need to also make sure that they reflect anything about reportable conduct scheme. So if you don't have that fully embedded in your systems, that's a really important opportunity for you to have to make sure everyone understands about the reportable conduct scheme. There's also an important thing there around the culture of reporting within organisations. It should be okay for everybody to say, hey, I'm not sure about this, a bit worried about this thing over here. Having a culture within your organisation that sees reporting as a positive thing to do, because what we're all doing here is we're joined up in the task of protecting children and young people, is a cultural tenet to be prioritised in your kind of change plan through your organisation. So having that clarity on where people need to go to, having good communication with children and young people about the allegation if it's about them, clear communication with parents and carers if that's appropriate, clear communication with staff and volunteers helps people just understand what's going on. In terms of the second part of this question, child abuse can be hard to spot. We know that, you know, these are things that were really demonstrated to us in particular in the Royal Commission into institutional child sexual abuse. People can be worried about whether is that grooming or not. I can't tell, because grooming, for example, can look sometimes like caring behaviour. So what you're wanting to do is have this kind of culture within an organisation where it's better to ask the question than not. You don't want people to be scared to ask the question. Is that inappropriate or not? Get them to ask the question. That's okay. But also ensuring children and young people are empowered. They need to know how to raise concerns if they're worried. They need to know what the adults should be behaving like in the organisation. Gets back to the code of conduct, gets back to the information that you're providing to children and young people about their rights. So you can see the whole system really comes into play to educate volunteers on the reportable conduct scheme. I might leave it there, Gillian.
Thanks, Emily. Then there's a question on child safe training. So the first one is, are you able to share some examples of positive change within organisations who have undertaken child safety training?
Thanks, Gillian. I'm going to answer this one. So our guide for creating a child safe organisation does have a few case studies which include positive outcomes following targeted training. So, for example, one of the case studies discusses a community-based conservation group that undertake cultural awareness training. And this training leads to the organisation forging new connections with Aboriginal groups and engaging an elder as a consultant to improve their policies and procedures to make them more welcoming for Aboriginal people. In this case study, you know, ultimately the families and children who attend the holiday programs report back how much they appreciate the welcoming and inclusive culture. So that's on page 36, that case study, if you want to read it further. Another case study that we have in our guide highlights organisations who are struggling to generate a consistent culture of child safety among staff who are in lots of different locations. So as part of the leadership's action to address this, they've recognised that staff hadn't been given enough guidance and training on how to approach high-risk activities with children. So when we say high-risk activities, for example, helping a child get dressed. So addressing this training need, again, in this case study, led to improved staff morale, staff retention rates, and a reduction of complaints from children. So you can read more about that case study on page 48 in our guide. We also have a really good example in our empowerment and participation guide. What I'll do is I'll read a quote. So this is from an organizational leader. And the quote is, "Some of our volunteers are anxious about the relationships they have with kids. They don't want people to think they're doing the wrong thing. So they keep them at arm's length and don't really interact. A big part of our training is letting them know what is appropriate and what's not and how to protect themselves. It's so important because we need our volunteers to show they care about the kids, but they need to have boundaries. They need to know we'll support them, but that there are rules." And I think this really speaks to what Emily was also speaking to before. You know, really highlights how child safe training benefits not just children and young people, but also the volunteers and workers in your organisation as well. So when there is training and clear guidance, your volunteers will feel more confident in how they interact with children. And it will help them understand and recognise and act on signs of child abuse and harm as well. Something to be mindful of is that increased numbers of notifications can be seen as an indication of positive change, in that people are identifying and reporting abuse. It's also worth mentioning that the Commission runs a child safe community of practice as well. And this is a forum where different organisations come together to share good practice. So I think Nat will put a link to that in the chat. If that's something that you're interested in, we do lots of case studies often in those, as well as hear from speakers, you know, with expertise in these areas. It's a great way to expand your knowledge and network with others. Thanks, Gillian.
Thanks, Elinor. Sounds great. I think the next question might be for you too. Also still under child safe training. We're planning on running child safety training for all our employees and volunteers. Does the Commission have online modules, training resources, or recommend training providers?
Yeah, Thank you. So we don't offer general online training modules on our website. We suggest that training be tailored to the needs of different staff and volunteers at your organisation, and it takes into consideration how you engage with children. And we also do not recommend specific training providers. But training should help volunteers know how to implement your organisation's child safety and wellbeing policy, your complaints process and policy, recognise indicators of child harm and respond to child safety issues, and build a culturally safe environment, as a few examples. Each organisation needs to consider your specific activities and roles with children, their ongoing developmental needs, and also the existing knowledge and skills of your volunteers in order to develop your approach to education and training. So the Commission has, as we've, I think, already covered, extensive online resources available on our website. And that it also includes on-demand videos for each of the child safe standards, and these can also help you. We also have a sample learning or training action plan for organisations as well, that you can access on our website. And lastly, in our commission, in our guide for creating a child safe organisation, you can find a list of resources. It's on page 134 that might be useful for your organisation looking to develop your own child safe training. Thank you, Gillian.
Great, thanks, Elinor. Okay, so the next theme is screening. There are two questions we've popped together. The first is how to encourage volunteers and educate them as to why screening is important. And then the second is how to encourage volunteers who do not work directly with children to undertake child safety, safeguarding training.
Thanks, Gillian. So screening is about ensuring people working or volunteering in an organisation are suitable. Fundamentally, if you can connect people with that idea, it helps them see why you're trying to work through a screening process with them. Screening ultimately helps you create a safe environment for children and young people, and it helps protect children and young people from harm. So the key here really is to help volunteers understand that screening is part of a shared responsibility to keeping children and young people safe. Every person in a community needs to play their part if children are to be protected from harm and abuse, and screening processes are a really important part of that. So if you're ensuring that screening is embedded within your organisation's child safety culture, then this will help you. Introducing and clearly communicating screening processes during the onboarding process helps volunteers to see it as part of the culture, and it sets the tone that child safety is non-negotiable in an organisation. You can also send a message of importance about screening processes to ensure they are consistently used for onboarding staff or volunteers. There's no exceptions. We screen everybody. That screening process may be tailored to the role, but at the end of the day, everybody needs to be part of a screening process. Screening needs to be regularly discussed in meetings. It's that frequent reasserting of its importance as part of your child safety systems, and it's got to be part of ongoing training that's provided, making sure that the people who are ultimately responsible for screening understand what they're looking for and understand how to deal with the issues that they may face during a screening process. Thinking through things like, if you're doing as part of your process referee checks, do the people who are conducting the referee checks actually know what they're looking for when they're doing these checks? What if they hear something that makes them go, oh gosh, I'm not quite sure about that? Who do they go to discuss whether that presents a child safety risk or not? So you've really got to think about how that screening process runs through your whole organisation. So you're making it as expected, a standard part of practice, and then volunteers are more likely to see it as part of their role rather than an optional extra. You can also make sure that your screening processes are accessible, that you've got transparency about them, so that everybody knows that they're in place. This also sends a signal to others outside the organisation that if they are trying to get into your organisation, that's what they're going to expect to face. It also can help you generate new volunteers, because we do find, I've got to say, when we engage with organisations, when they improve their child safety systems, people start to see that organisation as potentially child safe, and then they want to participate. So you got to think about it as a way of actually looking to the future of your organisation and the sustainability of volunteer numbers rather than driving people away. I think to be honest, I think it's the direct opposite of that. We've also seen, unfortunately, many examples of situations where harm could have been prevented if proper screening had been in place. So don't ever think that that's an unnecessary thing. My goodness, it's necessary. Volunteering organisations can be seen as places where you can more easily access children than, say, if they were going to a registered school or some other place. So understand that that can actually be seen as a bit of a target for people who mean to do children harm, and understand how your screening processes can prevent that. So look, building a strong culture of child safety is also central to the second part of the question you asked there, Gillian, too. Your organisation must demonstrate its commitment to child safety for volunteers, so that volunteers will take it seriously. So you could do this by requiring all volunteers, regardless of their roles, to participate in child safety training as part of your onboarding process. It's really important, for example, that the people who are dealing with HR practices or procurement understand child safety, not just those who are in child-facing roles. It takes that whole system approach again to make sure that children and young people are kept safe. Child safety champions, can't spruik them enough. Having those people within the organisation who are prepared to talk to others about the importance of child safety, and that's going to help bring others along with them. So, you know, the Child Safe Standards talks about modelling of good behaviour around child safety has to happen at a leadership level. It needs to happen at a middle management level. It really needs to be everywhere. If you don't have any champions talking about child safety within your organisation, you need to get some, so that really you can show all volunteers how important it is.
Thanks, Emily. There are two other questions which we've put together, also still under screening. The one is, in a sport, childcare, child activity setting, if the parent remains to oversee the child, do other parents and the supervisor still need a working with children check? And then the second question is, do parents who are helping out at sports training or on game day with a defined task need a working with children's check? In a sport, childcare, child activity setting, if the parent remains to oversee the child, do other parents and the supervisor still require a working with children check?
Great, thank you. So just remember, if you need to ask some specific questions about the Worker Screening Act and those legal requirements for working with children checks, just refer back to Working with Children Check Victoria. But from a Child Safe Standards perspective, I'll answer this question. Firstly, I want to be clear, and I want us all in this room to be clear, that grooming can happen when parents and carers are present. Right? A parent and carer present in a space does not mean a child will not be groomed. There can be an overemphasis on parents and carers being present as a sole risk mitigation strategy. That doesn't work. Motivated perpetrators who mean to abuse children will often groom parents and organisations as part of grooming children. So something that relies just on parents being present won't adequately remove risks to children. And I also want to highlight here, in response to this question, that working with children checks are only one part of selecting suitable people to work and volunteer with children and young people, and each role requires consideration about what the screening processes need to be. So it's vital that your organisation screens your volunteers for their appropriateness to engage with children, as we've been discussing earlier. So look, in this particular situation, you need to look at the individual role a parent, carer, or volunteer has been tasked with, to understand what the risk is that role presents to children and young people. And that should inform you what screening you need to undertake, but also what are the other things around that situation that you can do to reduce risks as well. If you're going to not require a working with children check, what else are you going to do to make sure children and young people are safe? It's always got to be the question with working with children checks. So in Victoria, many roles that require direct contact with children, regardless of whether they are paid or volunteer positions, require an individual to have a working with children check. And as we've said before, there are some roles that do not mandatorily require a check. So go to the Working with Children Check Victoria website to check that out. An organisation can still require a check, even if the Worker Screening Act doesn't say you have to have one. If your organisation does not require a check, you need to be clear on how risks to children will be managed at training or on a game day. So that whole child safety system comes into play. So the second, this sort of same approach applies to the second question too. The key takeaway in this situation is that a supervisor or parent performing a volunteer role must be assessed as suitable to perform that role. We see situations, for example, where a parent or carer may have behaved entirely inappropriately at a game, and if they then return to perform a role in the next game, dealing with children, does that mean that they are suitable just because they still maintain their Working with Children check? So there may be live behaviour that you need to be able to respond to as well. I might leave that one there.
Thanks, Emily. That's great. Then the next theme that we have is engaging children and young people. Again, we've put two questions together. Can you please outline what the requirements would be for an organisation to engage volunteers under 15 years of age, and how this may differ if they are volunteering for a school project or program such as the Duke of Edinburgh? The second question is there any advice on engaging partner schools with our organisation's child safe requirements? Schools have their own requirements. Any examples of collaboration in this space to ensure requirements are met, which reduces duplication, screening, etc., particularly teachers volunteering in our programs?
Thanks, Gillian. And yeah, that's right. These questions are both really about engaging children and young people as volunteers. So the legal requirements under the child safe standards for children or young people volunteering in an organisation compared to students who volunteer for a school program are not different. So you need to consider how to protect children, and that is the central focus. The standards do allow for flexibility to adapt to your context, so it is important to look at the unique characteristics of your organisation to determine, how the standards will apply within your organisation and what you need to do to keep children and young people of all ages safe. So in the example in these questions, schools will have a whole of school approach to complying with the standards. So that means they'll need to consider child safety in a range of different circumstances and environments, and that includes in the classroom, at events, or where they're using students in volunteer roles. So if your organisation is engaging volunteers under 15, as specified in this question, then you need to consider the environments they'll be volunteering and think about where child abuse can happen in your organisation. So you'll need to implement the standards for that context. It's important to highlight, though, that as I said at the start, like the fundamentals of the standards don't change. So the fundamentals is that your organisation takes deliberate steps to protect children from abuse, and that you must comply with all aspects of the standards. Another requirement you'll need to consider for engaging children under 15 as volunteers is whether your organisation requires a child employment licence. An employer usually needs a licence to employ someone under 15, whether that work is paid or voluntary. Wage Inspectorate Victoria manage those licenses, and you can find more information about it, those on their website. The second question asks about partnerships. So when developing a partnership or using third-party contractors, it's your organisation's responsibility to identify and manage any risks presented by a third party engaging with children. In this example, both the school and the organisation needs to fulfil their obligations to screen individuals that work with them, so that this may inevitably lead to some overlap. If you're asking for volunteers to have a Working with Children check, it's not enough to see a volunteer's card. You need to check that they've updated their Working with Children check details to include your organisation. So when the volunteer registers your organisation with Working with Children Check Victoria, This means your organisation will get told if that volunteers working with children check is suspended or cancelled, for example, if they were to be charged. We also want to highlight that it's important that you do not solely rely on a teacher being registered with VIT as proof that they are appropriate to engage with children and continue to be appropriate throughout their time volunteering with you. So a VIT registration doesn't operate in the same way as a working with children check in terms of organisations being notified. So if a teacher's VIT registration is suspended or cancelled, your volunteering organisation will not be notified. So you need to consider how your child safety processes will support you to know that a teacher remains appropriate to engage at your organisation if you're not going to ask for a working with children check. Thanks. I'll leave that question there, Gillian.
Thanks, Elinor. There is one other sort of under that section, but I also just wanted to say that in terms of partnering with schools, there definitely are examples of it out in the community, and but it would be very much case by case, as different schools will have their own policies and procedures, and as Elinor says, you as the organisation still have to have yours. Just because the school that you're working with has them doesn't mean that you then don't have to do anything. So I think it's a matter of going out there, looking, sharing ideas, talking to other people, other organizations that might be doing something innovative in this space, and seeing what's out there. The other thing that's just worth looking at is having a memorandum of understanding between the two organizations, so that you're quite clear on who's doing what within the partnership. So your MOU will be a sort of mechanism to formalize that. Justice Connect have a really good template on that, so that might be worth having a look at. And also the other question was, what would best practice look like from a child safe perspective in an organization that does not offer services to children, but does have volunteers who are under 18 years?
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so firstly, it's important to be clear that if your organisation does not provide programs or services to children, but does have volunteers under 18 years, then you are still required to comply with the child safe standards. So just to be really clear about that. So similar to my response in the above question, your legal requirements under the child safe standards don't change, whether you're a large organisation or a small volunteer-based organisation. But your approach to meeting the requirements may differ depending on your organisation's context. So you'll really need to consider what it means to be a child volunteering in your organisation and how they can be kept safe from abuse. So as mentioned in an earlier question, at the Commission, we have minimum requirements and compliance indicators for each standard. So organisations will generally comply with the standards if you produce the listed documents and complete the actions that are set out in the compliance indicators for each standard. So it's important to highlight, it isn't a set and forget exercise. The standards require that you regularly review your child safety policies and that you actively maintain a culture of child safety. So some examples of the compliance indicators that would show the Commission that you are meeting the standards and minimum requirements include that your organisation has a child wellbeing policy. It might be called something different, but essentially will cover how you keep children safe in your organisation. A code of conduct, which specifically includes what is appropriate and inappropriate conduct with children and young people, risk management plans. Your organisation includes child safety in your recruitment processes and screening. You have a complaints handling policy that is child focused, and that these are regularly reviewed and fit for purpose. And that is not an exhaustive list by any means, so please have a look at our short guide for more detailed information. Thanks, Gillian.
Thanks, Elinor. As Elinor said, that section of questions was to do with engaging children and young people as volunteers. The next two questions are actually engagement with children and young people. And the first, there are two that are very similar. The first is interaction with children any interaction, even if not direct. So for example, a facility housing different groups, one group in a separate room involves children, but another group are all adults, with neither group or room having a direct interaction, although there may be incidental interaction upon entry or exit to the building. And then the next question is, can you please explain incidental and more than incidental interaction? What if the interaction is possible but highly unlikely? So Emily, I think this is for you.
Thanks, Gillian. And look, we were trying to understand, I guess, this question from the two people who asked, just to make sure that we fully understood. And I do wonder whether that use of the word incidental might be referencing something perhaps in the Worker Screening Act that's about working with children checks. So for those two people who asked those questions, if that is what you were talking about in terms of, you know, direct and indirect contact and whether a working with children check is required, I do encourage you to seek that answer from Working with Children Check Victoria. From a child safe standards perspective, though, you know, different organisations are going to have different levels of responsibility for children and young people and different sorts of interactions, right? So it's important to understand that the child safe standards doesn't envisage that there's a one-size-fits-all approach to thinking through these situations. So you're going to need to consider what's needed to protect children in that particular scenario. So I can see there's some different kinds of scenarios there to think through. So you need to analyse and understand and then try and reduce the risk to children with the way that they perhaps engage with other children, young people, or with adults. So you know, thinking about direct and indirect interactions, you know, online can be direct. So let's not just think about direct being face-to-face. As we said before, grooming can happen via online means. There can be forms of, unfortunately, child abuse that happen online. So just because there isn't physical contact and physical engagement doesn't mean that there's not risks there that you need to manage. And just think about, you know, even well-run organisations who follow best practice approaches will still present some degree of risk to children. That's because it's an active and an ongoing process. As Elinor just said, this is not a set and forget exercise. You think you're fine. The moment that you don't do those reviews, the moment that you don't reflect on incidents that have happened and understand if there's fixes you need to make to your systems, is that, you know, the moment that unfortunately you might find yourself in a situation where some children and young people are placed at risk. So, you know, it's important to understand that children and young people can be harmed even when you might think the risk is low. You've got to think about it. Child safety is very practical. Think about it from a practical perspective. Look at the situation critically. What is the risk here? What can I do to keep children and young people safe? We've got some really good templates to help you with that process, which I think Natalie's already posted. That just really helps you to kind of probe the situations, probe your organisation, probe the particular activities that you're conducting, to just sort of think about what are the measures that I can put in place to reduce risks to children. Thanks, Gillian.
Great, thank you, Emily. And then our last two questions were two that we feel are not really relevant for the Commission, so I'm going to just mention them. But the one is whether there are additional insurance requirements for children under 18 when volunteering casually, working bees or events. This is out of scope for this particular session, but there is a lot of information on this, both on our website, but also with Justice Connect have looked very closely at what are the insurance requirements. So maybe just have a look at that. The other question was, if you're receiving government funding and you're required to sign a compliance statement to say that you're meeting child safe standards. So this is happening from a federal government level. I think it's coming through Department of Social Services, and we now sort of have first-hand experience because we've been dealing with the Strong and Resilient Communities grants, and that has been a requirement where all the grant recipients are required to sign a compliance statement. And there was a question about if an organisation doesn't have interaction with children, which of the compliance statements do they need to sign, and does this constitute compliance? We're not going to go into detail about it. We will post up a link there is a child safe statement of compliance process, which has been published by the Department of Social Services, so federal government, and frequently asked questions for grantees. So it does have a resource in there which kind of deals with this, but just be aware that it is happening with grant funding that's coming through at that level. That completes all of our questions at this stage. So I'm going to hand back to Vittoria just to see whether there were any other questions perhaps in the chat we can deal with.
Just bear with me.
Allow me to mute.
Yes. Thanks for that. That was a really engaging set of questions and responses. So thank you to everyone who submitted questions and to the team for providing such in-depth answers. It was so comprehensive that we didn't get many questions on the chat. But we did receive one question. And the question was asking where people can access training for volunteers on the child safe standards.
I can answer that if you like, Vittoria. So look, Elinor sort of set out before, I guess what's important to train volunteers in is probably not the child safe standards per se, it's actually child safety. So you need to be thinking about this in terms of what do my volunteers need to know to keep children safe in my organisation. So Elinor took us through a range of resources that you can use to build your training for your organisation. And in addition to that, we've got, I think it's a 10 or 11-minute short video that's on our website. If you do want to play a bit of an overview of the standards for volunteers, that can be a really useful tool just to kind of connect them with the high-level concepts around the child safe standards. There's also a training plan that we've got, a template there that you can use to work through what other particular training needs within my organisation.
Thank you for that. I've just received an additional question in the chat. And the question is asking if there's a case study of a small multicultural group that has embedded the child safe standards.
Look, good question. And we frequently get asked the question about who's the best practice organisation, who's done this really well. You can imagine that as a regulator, we're not going to be able to single out organisations because that's inappropriate really for us to comment publicly on another organisation's state of compliance. I think Elinor gave a really valuable suggestion. If you're trying to look at other organisations to say, hey, can we collaborate? Can we share practices? We just encourage that so much, right? There is so much you can learn from each other. So if you're not connected with other organisations that look like you and asking them the questions, how have you done this? How have you done that? That is absolutely number one, top of your list to do coming out of this session. We've got a community of practice that you're welcome to join. That is free to join. It's a largely in-person community of practice. The reason we make it in person is we want to encourage that networking. So if you're feeling alone out there in trying to implement the standards, please come and join this community of practice and we can connect you with some others who are doing this exactly the same work as you. If you're looking at some particular problems that you're having, I guess, implementing the standards within your organisation, please give us a call. There are staff at the Commission who spend all day talking through tricky situations with organisations when they're trying to implement. So if you've got a particular question, an issue that you're struggling with, please call us, please email us. The other thing to note is that I'm pretty sure, Elinor and Nat, that we've actually got a range of our videos also translated with closed captions that are translated into, I think, about 20 languages. So I think it might even be that basic child safe standards video that's got that translated as well. So there's a whole range of ways that if you're a small multicultural organisation, you can access some support to help you.
Thank you very much for that, Emily. Do we have any other questions that anyone would like to put in the chat? Just give it a little bit of time. Can't see chatting dots. All right, I might use our time as effectively as possible, and hand over to Elinor for what will be a really helpful navigation through the website of the Commission for Children and Young People.
Thank you. Let me just share my screen. Okay, can everybody see that? Thumbs up, thank you. Okay. We just wanted to take a few minutes to show you the Commission's website. I won't take you through everything, there's a lot there, but I'll try and navigate you to what I think will be most useful for you. So up here, this is our landing page. Up here you'll see is our resources tab, and that's probably the tab you're going to find the most useful. In our resources tab, you have resources and support for child safe standards and the resources and support here for reportable conduct. So this will have pretty much almost everything I think that we shared with you today is here in this on this web page, including the video that Emily was just speaking about, a short video about the child safe standards, and that is also correct. It's translated into 20 languages as well. The reportable conduct resources and support for reportable conduct scheme is found here. I would suggest, again, you have the video there, but also accessing the full collection of reportable conduct information sheets is probably what you're going to find the most useful. We have we're on number 22 information sheets at the moment that really go into detail about specifics of the reportable conduct scheme. Here you'll find our events and on-demand video, and specifically what you might find most useful is our 1.5-hour video on the 11 child safe standards, which you may find really helpful if you're wanting to know, specifics about the standards. There's also other videos on there from previous trainings and webinars and communities of practice as well that we've done. Again, information here for parents and carers, for children and young people, and then importantly here, our translated resources. So here you've got translated resources on reportable conduct scheme and child safe standards. So that's probably going to be the tab that you use the most. A couple of other things though, a few other things. Contact, obviously that's really important if you want to contact the Commission, but also if you want to subscribe for updates, that's where you'll find it. Which we really recommend. That way you'll know anytime we have new or updated guidance and resources. Also, if you are under the reportable conduct scheme, this is where you're going to report a concern or allegations right at the top of our website. Also, over here, you've got Child Safe Standards tab here. Important in this one is understanding cultural safety for Aboriginal children and young people. It's not just the guide here. We've also got tips sheet there. We've got a frequently asked questions with our Commissioner for Children and Young People, Mina Singh, also currently our Principal Commissioner, our Acting Principal Commissioner, and days of importance for Aboriginal communities as well. So you'll find that in that tab. Reportable conduct scheme. This would be useful if you're just sort of wanting to find out background information about the scheme, then this provides you with that sort of information. Two more things. Children and young people. This is for children and young people. So if you want to direct children and young people to resources at the Commission, this is all directed at them. That tab there. And lastly, our engagement tab. We have just released, we mentioned it in the Q&A, our framework, child and youth engagement framework. So ways that the Commission works with children and young people to empower them, to elevate their voices. If you want to implement any of that within your organisations, then you can find that. They're really excellent tool. I'll leave it there so that I don't overwhelm you with too much information. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Elinor. It was really helpful for you to take us on a bit of a tour of the website. Often websites have amazing resources and it's just knowing where to find it. So really appreciate that. That brings us to the end of the formalities for today. I would like to thank everyone for your strong engagement during this session. It was great to see so many of our partners come to this session and actively listen and reflect on what they've learned, and to our panel for your amazing insights and wisdom. As part of our efforts to drive continuous improvement, we would really appreciate it if attendees could please fill in feedback survey that I've placed in the chat. Sessions like today have been made possible courtesy of hearing from the sector what you need in order to feel empowered and deliver the best impacts out in the ecosystem. So we'd love to get some feedback from you to assist us with future work planning as well as continuous improvement. So yeah, that would be greatly appreciated. We will also have some correspondence that we send out after today's session, and that will include the links that we have shared from Volunteering Victoria in the chat, as well as a really comprehensive resource that Elinor kindly put together that provides a convenient snapshot of useful resources or links that you might want to have easily available in your work. So that will also be sent out post-session today. I would like to sum up with a big thank you again to everyone for coming here today, listening, actively engaging, and individually thank Elinor, Emily, Gillian, as well as Natalie, who's been working really hard on the chat to make this session as beneficial as possible for all of our partners. Thank you, and I wish you all a great afternoon, and I hope you've taken away some really valuable insights from today. Take care.